right, so welcome. I'm so glad you guys made it. There's only one service today. It's 9:30 or nothing. So usually, just a little insight into what goes on in my brain, usually when there are two services, there's always the feeling of like, even if 9:30 is a catastrophe, you can always make it up at the 11 o'clock, and then when you go home to make yourself feel better about yourself, you can be like, well, at least 11 o'clock went fine. Today, there is not that. There is no net. We're doing this. Whatever happens in the next few minutes, that was the service, and you were here for it, and you'll either be glad you were, or you'll be glad that there were food trucks after. So that's what's going on. Thanks for being here. Okay, so we are transitioning right into what we're here to talk about. So we are currently in the series that we started last week called the Confused Disciples Department. I forgot the name of the series, Peter's version. And so what we're doing with this series is we're trying to take a look at certain points of Scripture that talk about specifically what's going on in the life of this guy named Peter. And Peter was, as I think most of us probably know growing up in church, Peter was one of Jesus' 12 original disciples. And the thing about Peter is a lot of times in the stories about Peter, what's going on is the writers are kind of using Peter as kind of a stand-in for all of the rest of Jesus' disciples as a way of saying, like, yeah, they're all kind of working through this, and they're all trying to figure this out, and they're all kind of processing what exactly does it look like to be one of Jesus' disciples, especially when you're among the first of them. And so a lot of what we see Peter dealing with isn't just what Peter is not unique. He's not dealing with it all by himself. What's going on is like everybody, or a lot of it at least, these early folks were dealing with, and Peter becomes kind of the mouthpiece of that, if that makes any sort of sense. So Peter often kind of shows us a lens through which to look at the entire world through the eyes of all of Jesus' early followers. So it's not just about, so any stories about Peter, first of all, it's not just about Peter, it's about all of us in a certain kind of way. And so last week we talked about the story of Peter attempting to walk on water and kind of what that looked like and what the kind of the tension of that moment must have been. And so today we're looking at a whole other story. And there are certain stories about Peter, I think, that all of us know, kind of just having grown up in certain faith environments. There are probably others that we don't hear about a lot because it's like, well, what am I supposed to do with that? And so I think this is going to be one of those, I assume. So we're going to start kind of early before the actual part of the story begins, because the whole thing, one of the things you see a lot of times, specifically in the book of Matthew, is what Matthew is doing is he's not telling us these little like mini short stories like collected together and just kind of mashed all together in one place. What Matthew often is doing is he's telling us something where one thing builds on another thing. So a lot of times you'll be reading something that doesn't look like at face value that it has something to do with what's going on in the story that comes after it, but actually it directly informs that story, if that makes any sort of sense. So we're going to start in Matthew chapter 13, but the actual thing that happens that is specifically about Peter happens a little bit later, but we're going to see how these two things connect. So all that to say, stay with me. I would say it'll be better in the second service, but there won't be one. So this is everything. So in Matthew 16, beginning in verse 13, it says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi. Now let's stop right there because already the writer is giving us some interesting information. So we're going into this region called Caesarea Philippi. And to us in the 21st century United States, to us, that doesn't mean anything. It's just a place that maybe somebody knew about at one point. To Matthew's early readers, already there's some bells going off because Caesarea Philippi has an interesting history. So the city name, Caesarea Philippi, wasn't always called that. Originally, up until not too long before this story occurs, the city was called Paneas. It was changed very recently in the story by a guy named Philip, as it turns out, who was the son of Herod the Great. Now, here's the thing about that. Herod the Great was given the ability to rule the Judean territory, and as he began to kind of exit the stage, Herod's sons begin to sort of take over certain parts of the region. Now, the whole thing here is Herod looks like he's in charge, but he's not actually in charge because the whole thing is run by the Roman Empire, which is ruled by a guy called Caesar. So Caesar is the guy who rules everything, and he's the guy who decides who gets to be in charge of the Judean territory. So Herod the Great's son, Philip, is given control over this particular part of the region called Paneas. And so what Philip decides to do is he says, like, what's the best possible way to suck up to Caesar? Well, I could change the name of this region to Caesarea, but I also want Caesar to know that I'm like pretty powerful too. So I'm going to add my name to this as well. So hence Caesarea Philippi. So the name Caesarea Philippi it's the name of a region, but it also implies something about the mindset of the people who are living at this time, because it's telling you that everybody at this time is looking for ways to grab for power, and they're doing it by getting closer and closer to Caesar. So already, just the fact that this story occurs near Caesarea Philippi is Matthew saying, like, okay, this story is about a much larger story, okay? So that's all the geography I'm willing to give you at this moment, but that's where we're going to start. So it says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? Now, Son of Man is a way that Jesus would often refer to himself. This is a reference to the book of Ezekiel in the Old Testament. And so he says, who do people say the Son of Man is? They, the disciples, replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, who was an ancient Hebrew prophet, and still others, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. And also Jeremiah was another one of the Hebrew prophets. So basically, the answer that they're giving him is, look, everybody, they're saying to Jesus, everybody mostly believes that you are here to play some larger part of the story. And we're all participating in this story, but you, Jesus, happen to be a more important part of the story than most of the people we encounter. But nobody actually seems to agree on what that role is. Some people say, like, you're a new version of this old prophet. Some people have this notion that you are here to start something new, a la John the Baptist. And so everybody's kind of wrestling with, we're not totally sure, like, who you are and what you're doing here. Which, again, interesting that Jesus chooses this moment to ask this question, because they're standing near Caesarea Philippi. So Jesus comes to this place named for the Roman ruler, plus the Judean ruler that's been given power by the Roman ruler, Caesarea Philippi, and he says, hey, what are people saying about what I'm doing here? Does any of this connect with itself? Like, oh yeah, this whole thing is about how people view and experience power. So then in verse 15, Jesus says, but what about you? He asked, who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. This apparently is the correct answer, because in verse 17 it says, Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter. So at this moment, Jesus is changing Peter's name from Simon to Peter. So which is a pretty big deal in Peter's life. And it says, and on this rock I will build my church. And of course, the name Peter is a synonym in Greek, is the synonym for rock or stone or some sort of solid object. And it says, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone he was the Messiah, which is an interesting bit of the story. This is actually not even the story we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the next story, but we have to understand this story in order to fully get what's going on in the next story. So what's going on? So Jesus asks Peter, or the disciples, who do people say I am? Peter speaks for the group, and he says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Now, this word Messiah is loaded. This word has, and I had to draw some of this myself. The church I used to work for, we did not have screens at all. We were in a pretty small, confined space. Literally everything that I needed to show people, I had to draw myself. And so the only way I could think to do this next part was to go back to that old style. So not like the most sophisticated thing. I'm not a Photoshop master, obviously. So I just literally... Sharpie to paper is how we did this. So sorry if none of this is legible to you, especially through the chain link fence. But there's... So anyway, so this word, Messiah, is loaded. So now we, in the United States, 21st century, we have a post-resurrection view of this word. We hear the word Messiah, and we have all sorts of things that have been loaded into our software for a long, long time, right? Like we've gone to, like, at this probably most of us in our lives, dozens of Christmas pageants, have watched, various films depicting the life of Jesus or whatever. And so we have this language of Messiah just sort of built in, like, oh, Jesus is the Messiah, which means he dies for our sins and raises from the dead. That is how we have sort of processed and digested the idea of Messiah. In the first century, pre-resurrection, that is a very different notion of what's going on with this word. So in the first century, again, Rome controls everything. This is key. You have to understand there is nothing that Rome does not have ultimate authority over at this time and in this place. Even, by the way, how the citizens of Judea are allowed to observe their own religious traditions. There are certain times of the year when the Jewish leaders would have to go to the Roman authorities and ask for permission to celebrate certain festivals. And by the way, some of the objects that they would use to celebrate these festivals were kept under lock and key by Roman soldiers. So they literally had to go and ask permission to use their own stuff to celebrate their own festivals because Rome has control over all of it. So the idea here, the common belief, is one day someone will rise up and lead a revolution against Rome by force and give us our country back. And so the expectation is there will one day be someone who is able to lead a revolution and overpower the Roman Empire and get them out of here once and for all. And the word they would use when they would talk about that person was Messiah. So when Peter says, "You are the Messiah," what Peter is saying is, we believe that you are that revolutionary leader. We believe that there will come a point where you will push Rome out and assume power for yourself and give the country back to those of us who really deserve it. And so, and the assumption here is that this will be in a lot of ways led by violence and like grabbing for power and creating some sense of like national purity is the idea. This is like nationalism too, like truly like violent uprising nationalistic expectations is what you see with this statement. So when Peter says, "You are the Messiah," he is articulating that he believes that Jesus is this kind of person, which probably, by the way, is why Jesus tells everybody, don't tell anybody this, because everybody else is going to assume that that's what we're here to do also. So when Peter says, "You are the Messiah," one of the reasons we see that Peter is interested in being close to Jesus at this point is because if Jesus is about to assume power after pushing out Rome, the people who are closest to Jesus, they're going to have pretty good jobs. So there is this expectation of, we are going to be the ones with the power. We are going to be the ones who are calling the shots and are pushing the Romans out. So we are about to see, though, that Jesus and Peter have very different understandings of what the concept of Messiah is really all about, which leads us to the next part of the story. So in Matthew 16, verse 21, it says, "From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life." Which, by the way, if you're expecting a violent uprising led by this one particular figure, and he starts talking about how he's going to go and be arrested and suffer and die, all of a sudden this is really disrupting the narrative that you thought you were playing in your head, right? So there are lots of powerful people at this time and in this place. And Jesus, as he describes his own role in the story, sounds quite passive, does he not? So look at all the different passive verbs in this. It says he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things, and that he must be killed, and on the third day be raised. These are passive verbs. Like Jesus is using language about himself as if he is relinquishing some amount of control, which again runs contrary to the notion of Messiah, because the whole idea of Messiah in the first century Jewish mind is, this is about seizing control. But Jesus keeps talking as if he's planning to give up all of his control. So these are divergent ideas of what is expected of Jesus. And so if you have spent your whole life expecting a Messiah to lead a violent uprising, and now you're confronted by an alternative view of Messiah that looks like surrender and death and suffering, then all of a sudden, this might not work for you. You would be thinking, I didn't sign up for that. I signed up for a revolution. And what I'm hearing is we've all decided to just hold hands and jump off the cliff together. And that's not what I agreed to. And so look at Matthew 16:22. So Jesus starts talking about how he will be killed and suffer and be raised to life. Then in Matthew 16:22, Peter took him, Jesus, aside to rebuke him, which that's an odd choice, I suppose. And so Peter says, "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." So Peter has this thing of, even when Jesus himself tells you what Jesus's purpose is, Peter says, "I don't think you've got that quite right." So let's have a conversation. And we tend to, if you heard this story growing up, it's possible that you heard this and thought Peter's having an emotional response because he likes Jesus, because Jesus is his friend, Jesus is his teacher, and he doesn't want to see anything bad happen to him. And so you think Peter's having an objection here based on like love and friendship. That's not what's going on, because Peter's response is not personal. It's not based in friendship towards Jesus. Peter is having a theological response to this. Peter believes that Jesus' purpose in life is to overthrow the Roman Empire. Peter believes that Jesus has been sent by God to violently get rid of Rome. And Jesus says, that's not what I'm here for, and Peter disagrees. And so Peter has decided he's going to confront Jesus on all the ways that Jesus is wrong in his theology. So again, interesting choice. So Peter's idea of what the Messiah is supposed to be is very different than Jesus' idea of what Messiah is supposed to be, and Peter can't take it anymore, and so he has to say something. So not even, as it turns out, sometimes not even God in the flesh can talk you out of your theological assumptions. Not a new thing. So then the very next verse, Jesus takes it to the next level. He really ratchets it up. So in Matthew 16, verse 23, Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Which, okay, we've hit the big red button now. So Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Which a lot of times we talk about Jesus' disciples, and like Judas gets a really bad kind of run because he's the one who betrayed Jesus. Thomas gets called Doubting Thomas because he had that one time where he was like, "I'd like to see it, please." And so we have like Doubting Thomas and Judas the betrayer. Very rarely do we be like, "Oh right, there was also that time that Jesus called Peter Satan." So what's going on? Like this seems like a massive overreaction to a theological objection, right? Get behind me, Satan. So why does Jesus go to this place so quickly? Why does it escalate like this? So a thing that this entire section of Matthew so far, if starting all the way back to where we began with the story, a thing that the entire section has been showing us is this: Jesus is on a very specific path. So that stick figure guy, that's Jesus. So he's on a very specific path. There is a trajectory to what Jesus is up to in the world. And the trajectory is, I am here to bring like a new way of being. I'm here to ultimately to suffer, to die, to resurrect, so that we can show people that there's a better way to be, that it doesn't have to come, like renewal and new life and hope and love and grace and peace don't have to come by force. In fact, a lot of times, force makes it worse. So Jesus is on a very specific path. And what we've seen, we have seen, that Jesus is in the restoration business. He is moving through the world with a sense of grace and peace and love. This is the path that he's been traveling the whole time. He has not been secretive about this being the ultimate agenda. Then, when he tells his followers that his path will include his own suffering, Peter doesn't know how to process it. He's absolutely, he's baffled. He does not know how to deal with it. And so he voices his objections, and he tries to tell Jesus, that's not what you're supposed to be. That's not what we're doing here. So what we learn is Jesus and Peter have very different understandings of Jesus' path. Jesus has a path. Peter has very strong opinions about what that path should be, and he voices those opinions. And Jesus says, actually, I do kind of already understand my path. And so Jesus has a path, and Peter doesn't agree with that path. So, but that doesn't answer the question, why does Jesus call Peter Satan? So let's go to the language. So this is actually a Hebrew term. It's called, the term is ha-satan. This is not a proper name. A lot of times we hear this word Satan, and we tend to think that it's like there's a guy with a pitchfork and horns, and he's got a business card, and it says Satan on it. You know what I mean? And so it's not that. This is not the name. This is not a proper name of a particular character in the Bible. We often think that it is. We talk like it is. It isn't. Ha-satan is not a proper noun. It is, so the word ha-satan is, it is a Hebrew word that literally means, it has a couple of different possible translations. One is the word accuser. We see this used sometimes in translation of this word. Another is adversary. Or the one that actually most directly applies in this particular situation is one that obstructs a path. So, for example, if you have ever had to cross Broadway, it's not that way. I think which way is Broadway? Maybe it is that way. I don't know. It's new to Advent. So if you've ever had to cross Broadway, and it's almost your turn at the light, but then those arms come down and the train is coming. Are you with me? Are you with me in my pain at this moment? If you've ever been running late to pick up your kids for something and you don't want to catch grief from the dance instructor or the baseball coach, but then you see that train coming and then the train starts to slow down as it starts to cross the train tracks and you begin to use all the curse words you know and inside your car. Why? What's the frustration here? The frustration is you're trying to get somewhere. You're on a path and the train is obstructing your path. At that moment, I'll go ahead and say it, the train is Satan. So Because what's going on here is you have a trajectory. You are moving in a specific direction. You have a specific objective in mind. You have a point A and a point B that you are trying to reach, and you're almost to where you're trying to go, and all of a sudden this one thing stops you from getting to where you're trying to go. That thing is, in literal Hebrew terms, that thing is ha-satan. That thing is obstructing your path. So Jesus has a path. And Peter comes along and says, I don't like your path. And Jesus says, you are currently obstructing the path. So if someone is on a specific trajectory and then something else gets in the way and obstructs that path, the thing blocking that path is literally ha-satan. That thing is, in Hebrew terms, that thing is acting as Satan. So again, not like a proper name of a character with like red pajamas. This is a thing. It is a noun that describes something that is obstructing a path. So what's happening? Jesus is articulating what his path is about. Peter doesn't want Jesus to take that path. He wants him to take a different path. So Jesus tells Peter, you are trying to get in the way. You're trying to slow down what God is doing in the world. So on the next slide here, so Jesus is saying, I have this path, and you are obstructing the path. Peter is the thing in the way. And so, as an aside, by the way, if we'll go all the way back to verse 18, if you remember when we were talking about that earlier, Jesus gives Peter a new name. Or actually, he gives Simon a new name, which is Peter. So the new name literally means rock or stone. So in verse 23, the most literal translation has Jesus calling Peter a stumbling stone. So, because he says you're acting as a stumbling block, the literal translation is you're a stumbling stone. So Jesus is actually playing with words here as he's, because these two stories happen right next to each other, right? Like in one story, Jesus praises Peter and gives him a new name. And then in the next story, Jesus calls Peter ha-satan and then kind of gives a spin on the name where it's like, yeah, but it's not that, I wanted you to be a stone, but not that kind of stone, right? He's basically saying, I really want you to be, like, I called you a stone because, like, you're reliable and you get it to a certain degree, but you're actually, right now, at this moment, you're acting like this other kind of stone, and that's pretty lame, and I'd appreciate it if you'd stop it. So that's my personal translation. So Jesus uses this language of rock and stone as kind of like this play on words. Like, yeah, I called you this, but actually right now you're acting like this. So so there's this whole situation going on at this time between rabbis and disciples. So the goal at this time, the goal of a disciple is to follow the same path as a rabbi. The Hebrew word for a disciple is talmidim. And the image here of a talmidim is that the rabbi would walk in front of the talmidim, of the disciple, and the disciples would walk directly behind the rabbi, because how else are you supposed to learn what the rabbi does? So the whole purpose of a disciple is to become as much like the rabbi as possible, and the best way to do that is to follow as closely behind the rabbi as you possibly can. In fact, there are stories even of rabbis like going to the bathroom and having the disciples like stand as close as possible, even during that, just to see if there's like a specific prayer that the rabbi prays during those moments. So there is this sort of understanding that the closer behind the rabbi the disciple follows, the more faithful that disciple is, the better the talmidim is in relation to the rabbi. So the posture of a disciple is always to be behind the rabbi. So when Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, get behind me, Peter, because you're acting like an obstruction, he's not blowing him off. Like, again, growing up hearing the story, I always thought, like, he's just saying, like, get out of here. You know what I mean? Like, sort of like that kind of phrasing. That's not actually what he's saying, though. He's not saying, get behind me, like, get out of my face. If you are a disciple, your job is to never be walking in front of your rabbi. If you're walking in front of the rabbi, you are in the wrong place. So you would always, if you were a disciple, you would always walk behind the rabbi. So So Jesus is using this really interesting language. He's saying, get behind me, you are obstructing my path. Get behind me. He's not saying, get out of my face or get out of here. He's saying, you're standing in the wrong spot. Your job, if you are truly trying to follow me, your job is to be behind me and not in front of me. So Jesus, again, not blowing Peter off. He's pointing out that he is the rabbi and Peter is the disciple, and it's Peter's job to literally be behind Jesus, following his path instead of standing in the way of his path. Jesus is basically saying, I am not in the business of forcing my way into people's lives and using violence and force to accomplish my goals. And if you are going to be my disciple, if you are going to be my talmidim, you cannot be in that business either. You have to walk behind me and learn to interact with the world like I do. Otherwise, you're just in the way. Jesus says to Peter, I have a path, and you are getting in the way. What I would love is for you to follow me and participate in the new kind of story I am telling. So look at Matthew 16, verse 24, right after this. So it says, then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple, my talmidim, must deny themselves, take up their cross, which is an instrument of torture and death, and follow me. Take up your cross here is, if you want to follow this path that I'm on, it will likely involve some amount of self-sacrifice or giving up the pursuit of more and more power, which for a lot of these guys, very likely, is not at all what they signed up for. This is a complete rewriting of the software, because they signed up for revolution. They signed up, they thought they were following one kind of Messiah, and Jesus says, no, it's not like that. The path is not what you think it is. So, and then in verse 25, it says, for whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? In other words, it is possible to force your way to the top, to kill and to manipulate and to bully and get yourself all the way to the top. That is possible. You can try to grab for power in ways that only bring more and more violence and pain and suffering. We've all seen it. It is completely a thing that people can do. And you may actually succeed, but what will that have cost you? Is, I think, what Jesus is trying to say here. If you do actually do that, even if you get all the way to the top with that method, what will that have cost you? What will have been the price for that? What do you when you finally reach the top, will you even still have your soul when you get there? Will you even be who you believe you are anymore? So Jesus, again, says, I'm on a path, and my path is largely defined by self-sacrifice. It is a path that will always honor the humanity of everyone involved. It does not require violence or force or cruelty. It should never require us to forfeit our humanity or our souls. Jesus is trying to do something healing and redemptive in the world. But Peter wants him to do something else. Peter wants Jesus to fit inside of his own expectations and his own image of what God is like. In other words, Peter wants Jesus to hate all the same people that he does, and Jesus is not going for it. If we are trying to identify with Peter in this story, which I think we should, we have to admit to ourselves that sometimes we want God to hate all the same people that we do and to fight all the same battles that we think need to be fought. We want God to want the same laws that we want. We want Jesus, we want Jesus to punish the people that we want to see punished, right? And Jesus says, that's not what this is. Like you may be following a path that you don't fully understand. You are missing the point. And not only that, you're getting in the way. It is possible to use lots of religious language and to have deep religious convictions and to still completely miss the point entirely. It is impossible to believe in Jesus and to have lots and lots of faith and energy for this whole thing and to still want to see harm come to your enemies and to use your faith as a weapon against other people. That is completely possible. That's where Peter is. And Jesus says, yeah, you're in the way, and I'd prefer it if you were behind me, learning what I'm doing. Look at Matthew 23. This is a section, by the way. Matthew 23 could be a whole series all unto itself. This is a section that's often referred to as the 7 woes, and it's Jesus basically speaking to religious leaders, and he's saying, woe to you because of these particular ways that you're treating other people. So in Matthew 23, verse 13, Jesus says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are." Again, very strong language. What's he saying? He's saying, you spend all this energy trying to get people into, like, being on the team and getting the uniform. But then what do they do with that? Oh, they turn it against other people, and they begin to weaponize their faith, and it actually ends up doing lots of harm. So then jump down to verse 23. It says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel." And again, verse 25, "Woe to you, teachers of the law, you and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside will also be clean." Again, dealing with issues of hypocrisy and how we treat other people and how we see ourselves. Then verse 27, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness." And when Jesus talks about hypocrisy and wickedness, he's almost always talking about, this is how you're treating people who have less power than you, and I don't like it. So Jesus says, I am on a path of self-sacrifice. My path is defined by love and mercy and grace and peace. And if you are using Jesus-y religious language to push against that path, you are actually getting in the way. It's not just that you're not on the path, you're making the path worse for the rest of us. So we can spot this in 1,000 ways today. And I mean, probably the most healthy way to do it would be to look in the mirror and ask, is any of this in me? But even as we sort of examine what's going on around us, let's say, I don't know, let's assume we lived in a state where there were elected officials who wanted to force kids in public schools to learn certain Bible passages. I mean, just imagine. And so, is coercion a part of the path? No. Is force, is manipulation, are these things, is this what we are called to do or to be? I don't believe it is. I don't think Jesus would say, yeah, that's the path I'm on. If people's jobs rely on their being able to regurgitate certain amounts of religious doctrine that we believe, then all of a sudden, this isn't about grace or peace or choice or freedom or any of those things. It's about force. It's about coercion. It's about violence. And I think Jesus would say in those circumstances, yeah, you're getting in the way. Or what about people who have been made to feel unloved or unwelcome in churches? I could tell you all kinds of stories from when I was a pastor. And I would have either people who were who would consider themselves part of the LGBTQ plus community who would come and visit my church, or like family members of people who considered themselves part of that community. And they would say, I'm here because the church where we were told me I couldn't stay. Or I'm here, or I like at least once had a teenager who was gay come to my church and say, I'm staying with my friends who come to this church. My parents kicked me out when I came out to them last week. These are the kinds of stories we hear. And it's not coming from like people because of just different personality conflicts. A lot of times, most of the time, it's driven by how people have come to understand the Bible and God and religion. And so Jesus is saying, yeah, if you following me looks like you kicking your child out of the house because of who they are, then you're not just not helping, you're actually in the way. You're standing in the way. And what I would love is if you could stand behind me so that you could follow the path that I'm on. And the path that I'm on looks a lot like love and grace and mercy. There are thousands of people every single week leaving churches and never coming back because they are disillusioned and frustrated and angry. Why? Because of how local churches have treated people. And Jesus, I would argue Jesus is saying, I don't like that any more than you do. That is an obstruction. That is, you are getting in the way. That is ha-satan. And the path is better than that. The path is more interesting than that. I think in all of these situations, Jesus would turn to those of us who have power and have a voice in the church. And he would say to us, "Get behind me, Ha-Satan." In other words, you aren't following the path that I'm on, and you need to find your way back to it. And until then, you're actually just kind of getting in the way. And it's slowing things down for the rest of us. We're trying to get somewhere. We're trying to bring more grace and peace and love into the world, and you're making it worse. So please walk behind me. And if this is hard to hear, and I know it can be, take a few minutes and ask yourself why. Like, why do I struggle with this? Is it because I have certain assumptions that I was handed, and I'm having a hard time shaking off those assumptions? Is it because I have a certain amount of power, and I really like having that amount of power, and it's difficult for me to ask questions about what does it look like for me to loosen my grip on that? I'm sure it was hard for Peter to hear. I'm sure Peter did not love being called Satan. I'm sure it was hard for the leaders in Matthew 23 to hear when he says, "Woe to you, you blind guides, you hypocrites. You're making it worse." It's never easy for us to hear these kinds of things. And again, it is so easy for us to look out and to say, like, yeah, this group of people, they're all doing it wrong, you tell them. But maybe the question for us needs to be, is there any of that in me? Are there any ways that I'm getting in the way? Are there ways that I'm making it harder for people to encounter a Jesus that offers love and grace and peace and mercy to the world? Am I making things worse? Am I standing in the path? Am I walking in front when I should be walking behind? So, for those of you who have been alienated or disillusioned or wounded, for those of you who feel out of place in religious circles because of how somebody else has made you feel, that was not the path that Jesus called us to walk, and I'm sorry that was your experience. For those of us who this is your last stop, for those of you who are like, yeah, we tried a couple of different churches, and every one of them made me feel worse and unwanted and more alienated than the last place. And maybe your response to that was like, we'll try the well, and if that doesn't work, well, then I guess we're done. First of all, I'm glad you're here. Thank you for being here. And second of all, may you, while you're here, experience some amount of healing and grace and love. May you find that you have been welcomed the whole time, regardless of how somebody else made you feel. And for those of us for whom this is difficult, for those of us for whom we struggle with how to receive this message and how to sort of push back against things like coercion or manipulation or force or indoctrination of other people who maybe haven't been asked or haven't been asking for that. For those of us who feel like, well, that's what you have to do. That's what it looks like to make people believe in Jesus. You have to force them to. Like, yeah, I don't think Jesus isn't interested in that kind of thing. I think maybe it would help us to begin to reframe and reevaluate what it looks like for us to even be a part of the story at all, for us to walk behind Jesus and not out in front. So may we repent, may we heal from those tendencies, from those practices, from those impulses. May we choose to be people who walk behind Jesus as he shows love and grace and mercy, as he takes up his cross, as he offers himself, as he sacrifices himself for the well-being of others. Jesus is not in the business of force and power grabbing and manipulation. Jesus is in the business of suffering and sacrifice and love and grace and mercy. And may we be on that same path, or at the very least, may we not be in the way. Let me pray for us. God, we thank you for this invitation to follow, to get behind you in all the ways that you intend for us to be behind you. For those of us who are wounded, for those of us who have felt the business end of somebody else's religious beliefs, may we heal from all of those experiences. May we find that we are invited to be on a path that is oriented towards grace and love and mercy and self-sacrifice and peace. May we follow behind and not attempt to walk in front, because when we try to walk in front, we only get in the way. May we learn that loosening our grip on power is a much more interesting story than grabbing for it. And for those of us who have been wounded, may we heal, may we find grace, may we find love, may we find peace, may we find a home in places where we never expected. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. All right, I want to invite the ushers to come on up. We're going to take communion. And communion is one of these things. We do it every single week, but it's one of these things where we are invited, I suppose, to follow this path, to be on the same path that Jesus invites us to be on. Communion in and of itself is an act of self-sacrifice. It's Jesus saying, this is my body broken, this is my blood poured out. Jesus is saying the whole thing is not about force or coercion. The whole thing is about breaking myself open and pouring myself out, and that's the journey that we're all invited to be on. And so as we receive communion, and by the way, everyone is invited to receive communion. If you don't want to, you don't have to. Please don't feel like you have to, but if you want to, you are more than welcome to. But as we sort of prepare ourselves for that, may we remember that simply by taking this, we are acknowledging that the whole story is oriented towards breaking ourselves open and pouring ourselves out. The whole path is about self-sacrifice and the relinquishment of power and not grabbing for power. If the whole thing was about grabbing for power, we would not have an image of a Jesus body broken and blood poured out. It would be a different story altogether. So as we prepare to take this, may we ask ourselves, am I really a part of a story that's about giving up power, that's about grace and love and peace? So if you have one of the little communion kits, go ahead and peel off the top layer. There's a little wafer-like thing in there. This is meant to represent the body of Jesus, the body of Christ broken for you. And Jesus says, take and eat and do this in remembrance of me. So take and eat. And then go ahead and peel off the next layer, and that should open the thing up. And there's some grape juice in there, and this is meant to represent the blood of Christ poured out for you. And Jesus says, this is my blood poured out for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Do this to acknowledge this is your path too. Take and drink, church. So may we participate in a story about a body broken and blood poured out, and may we follow that same path.